It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend away. I needed a break from the city's chaos, the constant noise, and the never-ending bustle. So when I found this quaint little Airbnb nestled in the countryside, it seemed like a dream. The pictures showed a rustic cabin surrounded by woods, promising peace and solitude. Little did I know this trip would turn into a nightmare I'd never forget. I arrived late in the afternoon. The cabin was more isolated than I had anticipated, with the nearest neighbor miles away. The first thing that struck me was the silence, a stark contrast to the city. It was almost too quiet, but I brushed off the unease, attributing it to my city dweller instincts. The cabin was charming, with a cozy living room, a small kitchen, and a bedroom upstairs. The decor was a mix of old and new, and there were photos on the walls of what I assumed were previous guests. I settled in, cooked dinner, and decided to call it an early night. That's when things started to get strange. It was around midnight when I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then I heard it again. A soft, almost whisper-like sound coming from downstairs. I lay in bed listening, my heart pounding. The sound didn't repeat, so I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The next day was uneventful. I went for a walk in the woods, read a book, and enjoyed the solitude. But as night fell, I couldn't shake off a feeling of unease. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, a habit from living in the city. That night, the noises returned. This time they were louder, more distinct. It sounded like someone was moving around downstairs. I grabbed the lamp from the bedside table as a makeshift weapon and cautiously made my way down. The living room was empty. I checked the kitchen, then the small bathroom. Nothing. But then I noticed something odd. One of the photos on the wall was askew. I hadn't touched it, and there was no reason for it to have moved. My heart raced as I straightened it, and that's when I saw it. Behind where the photo had been, there was a small, almost imperceptible door. Curiosity overcame my fear, and I opened it. It was a tiny room, barely big enough to stand in, and what I saw inside made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in what looked like frantic scribbled notes, and photos of people with their eyes scratched out. Some of them were the same photos hanging in the living room. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had to leave. Now! As I packed my things, I heard the noise again. This time it was unmistakable. Footsteps. Upstairs. Someone was in the house with me. I bolted out of the cabin, not caring about my belongings, and ran into the woods. The darkness enveloped me as I ran blindly, not knowing where I was going, just needing to get away. I could hear someone, or something, chasing me, the footsteps heavy and relentless. I don't know how long I ran or how I eventually found my way back to the main road. I didn't stop until I saw the lights of a passing car and flagged it down. The driver, a local, listened to my frantic story and immediately called the police. The investigation that followed was disturbing. The cabin had been rented under a false identity. The small room I had found was a hidden space used by the cabin's owner, who had a history of mental illness and obsession with his guests. The police found evidence of him living in that hidden room, watching, listening. I was lucky to get out when I did. I never returned to that cabin, and I became much more cautious about where I stay. That weekend was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, but it turned into a horrifying ordeal that haunts me to this day. The silence of the countryside no longer feels peaceful to me. It feels ominous, hiding secrets better left undiscovered. As a frequent traveler, I've stayed in my fair share of Airbnb accommodations without incident. That streak of luck ended the moment I booked a quaint-looking cottage in a small coastal town. The listing boasted of serene views and an escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. Just what I needed after a grueling project at work. Upon arrival, the cottage appeared as charming as its pictures, nestled between dense woods and a rocky shoreline. However, something felt off. The silence was not serene. It was oppressive, heavy with an unspoken dread. I chalked it up to city dweller paranoia and unpacked. The first night was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, while making coffee, I noticed something odd, a small, almost imperceptible door in the kitchen. It was cleverly camouflaged with the wallpaper. Curiosity piqued. I tried to open it, but it was locked. Something about that door sent shivers down my spine. As the day progressed, I explored the town and returned to the cottage feeling more at ease. That night, however, things took a sinister turn. I woke up to the sound of whispers. Disoriented, I tried to pinpoint their source, only to realize they were coming from the direction of the small door in the kitchen. I approached, heart pounding in my chest. The whispers ceased abruptly as I neared, replaced by a bone-chilling silence. I stood there frozen until my rational mind kicked in, convincing me it was just the wind. The next day, I found an old rusty key in the garden. My mind raced back to the locked door. Against my better judgment, I decided to see what lay behind it. The key turned with a screech, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow, descending staircase. The air was stale, thick with dust and a faint, musty odor. I descended, each step creaking under my weight. The staircase ended in a small, dimly lit room. There I found something that turned my blood cold. Photographs, hundreds of them, plastered on the walls. They were all of the cottage's guests, captured in candid moments, unaware of the lens. In the center of the room was a chair facing a two-way mirror, which I realized was the bedroom mirror. The realization hit me like a freight train. I had been watched, studied like an exhibit in this twisted gallery. Panic set in, and I bolted up the stairs, locking the door behind me. I packed in a frenzy, ready to leave this nightmare behind. As I was about to step out, the front door swung open, and there stood the cottage owner, his eyes wide with a mix of anger and madness. He spoke in a calm, eerie tone. "You weren't supposed to find that." His hands were trembling, clutching something in his pocket. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I pushed past him and ran, not stopping until I reached the safety of my car. Driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror to see the owner standing in the doorway, watching me leave. The image of those photos, his gaze, and the whispers haunted me for months. I reported the incident to the authorities, but by the time they investigated, the cottage was empty, cleaned out, as if nothing had ever happened. The owner was never found. This experience left me with more than just a chilling story. It left an indelible mark on my psyche. The world, I learned, has hidden depths of darkness, some lurking behind the most unsuspecting doors. I've always been fascinated by horror stories, but little did I know that I would one day become the protagonist of one myself. This chilling tale happened to me a few months ago when I decided to spend a weekend getaway in a remote cabin I found on Airbnb. What I experienced that night will forever haunt me. The cabin was nestled deep within a dense, ancient forest. Its rustic charm and isolation from the world drew me in. The host, a man named Samuel, had only one rule: enjoy your stay and respect the woods. Sounded simple enough. Little did I know this trip would be far from ordinary. I arrived at the cabin on a gloomy Friday afternoon. The weather had already started to turn, with the sky heavy with thick clouds. As I approached the cabin, it looked even more eerie than in the photos. The wood was weathered, and the windows were dark and unwelcoming. But I'd already paid, so I hesitantly stepped inside. The interior was quaint, if not a bit outdated. The furniture was worn, and the air smelled musty. I decided to make the best of it and settled in. As the night approached, I lit a fire in the fireplace and started to read a book. The wind howled outside, and the cabin creaked as if it had a life of its own. Around midnight, I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. A faint whisper, like the voice of a child, echoed through the cabin. I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Help me." My skin prickled with fear as I looked around the dimly lit room, but I saw nothing. I was alone in the cabin, or so I thought. The voice continued to call out, growing louder and more desperate with each repetition. "Help me! Please help me!" I grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside, following the sound of the voice. The forest was pitch black, and the trees seemed to close in around me. The voice led me deeper into the woods, and I couldn't stop myself. It was as if I were under some sort of spell, unable to resist. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a decrepit, abandoned cabin. Its windows were shattered, and the door hung off its hinges. The voice now emanated from inside, urging me to enter. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open and stepped into a nightmare. The room was illuminated by a dim, flickering light. In the center, I saw a child, a girl of no more than 10, sitting on the floor. She was pale, with matted hair covering her face. Her eyes, hollow and lifeless, stared right through me. "Help me," she whispered one last time before vanishing into thin air. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and rushed out of the cabin. I retraced my steps through the dark forest, finally finding my way back to my Airbnb cabin. I locked all the doors and windows, trying to make sense of what had just happened. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, seemed like a sinister presence lurking just beyond my sight. Sleep was impossible, and I spent the night wide awake, clutching a kitchen knife for comfort. With the first light of dawn, I packed my bags and left the cabin behind. I couldn't shake the image of that haunted girl from my mind. I drove away from the forest, relieved to be leaving that place of horror behind. When I returned home, I did some research on the cabin in the forest. It turned out that the woods were once home to a remote community that had vanished without a trace many years ago. The cabin I had stumbled upon was rumored to be the place where a young girl had gone missing, never to be found. I couldn't help but wonder if I had encountered her restless spirit that night, trapped in the darkness of the forest, desperately seeking help. I had survived the disturbing Airbnb horror story, but the memories would haunt me for the rest of my life. And I knew one thing for sure: I would never venture into those woods again, no matter how charming the Airbnb listing may seem. It all started as a much-needed escape. After months of grueling work, I decided to take a solo trip to a small town, renowned for its serene beauty and historical charm. Browsing through Airbnb, I found a quaint, secluded cottage at the edge of the town. The reviews were great, and the host seemed pleasant. Perfect for a peaceful retreat, I thought. I arrived on a crisp autumn evening. The cottage, surrounded by dense woods, had an eerie quietness. Just the usual rural silence, I reassured myself. The host, Mr. Thompson, a middle-aged man with a friendly demeanor, greeted me. After a brief tour and some local tips, he left. The first night was uneventful, except for the creaking floorboards, which I attributed to the old structure. The next morning, I explored the town, returning to the cottage as the sun dipped below the horizon. That's when things started to get strange. I was cooking dinner when I heard it, a soft whisper. I paused, listening intently, but it was gone. Must be the wind, I thought. Later, as I settled in the living room, the whispers returned, this time a bit louder, accompanied by faint footsteps upstairs. My heart raced. I mustered the courage to check, but found nothing. That night, I barely slept. The whispers seemed to circle around me, unintelligible but insistent. In the morning, frazzled and sleep-deprived, I contacted Mr. Thompson, inquiring about the history of the house. He casually mentioned that it was built over a century ago and had been in his family ever since. Nothing more. The third day brought a palpable sense of dread. Objects seemed to move on their own. A book I had left on the table was now on the floor. The chair by the fireplace was oddly repositioned, and the whispers grew more persistent, almost angry. On the fourth night, the true horror unfolded. I woke up to a chilling presence in the room. The air was thick with a sense of something sinister watching me. I could hear faint, ragged breathing that wasn't mine. Paralyzed with fear, I lay there until the first light of dawn, when the presence receded. Determined to uncover the truth, I visited the local library. The librarian, an elderly lady, listened intently as I described my experiences. Her face paled. She retrieved an old newspaper clipping. It detailed a grim story from the late 1800s about the cottage. A young boy, the original inhabitant, had vanished without a trace. His parents were devastated and eventually left the house, which stood abandoned for years. I returned to the cottage, my mind reeling. As dusk fell, the atmosphere grew oppressively heavy. The whispers were now clear, pleading. "Help me," they said. I realized it was the voice of a child, the lost boy perhaps. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room waiting. As midnight approached, the temperature dropped. A misty figure materialized in front of me. A boy, no more than 10, his eyes filled with sadness and fear. He spoke of being trapped, unable to leave this world. His presence in the house, his unfulfilled desires had bound him here. I knew what I had to do. The next day, I contacted a local priest and explained everything. Skeptical at first, he agreed to perform a blessing at the cottage. As he recited prayers, the atmosphere lightened and the whispers faded away. I left the cottage the next day, but the memory of that boy and his tragic fate stayed with me. The whispers may have ceased, but his story lingers, a chilling reminder of the unseen presences that might dwell in old, forgotten places.